Hey guys, it's James here with Appalachian DIY. We're working on a 94 4Runner today and doing brakes and repacking wheel bearings and all that good stuff. Alright, once you have the wheel off, you want to get this brake line free, because when you pull the caliper you don't want to stress out this metal brake line and break it or kink it or anything like that. Alright, now that you got that free, you can move your brake hub freely. Go ahead and remove these two 17mm bolts that hold the brake caliper in. Alright, next go ahead and remove all these 12mm bolts. Remove any loose washers that you find, and also any loose bushings. If they're not loose, that's fine, we'll deal with that in a minute, but remove any of the loose bushings and washers that you can. Any of the loose bushing, or any of the bushings that weren't loose, go ahead and put a nut like that on the outside of the stud, and then they'll be ready for the next step. Alright, so the next step is to go ahead and remove this dust cap. Carefully remove the outer plate. Use a screwdriver if you need to pry down here. Pop it loose. These little bushings in here will want to go flying. That's why we put the nuts on the outside, just to make sure we don't lose any of these bushings. Once you've got all the bushings loose, go ahead and pop the plate off. Okay, once you get to this point, you'll see a lock ring right here, or snap ring. And the easiest way to do these is actually just with a little screwdriver, or two screwdrivers even, and a hammer. If you have snap ring pliers, it might make it a little easier, it might not, but you can try it. Just open the ring, put a little screwdriver, and then work it out like that. Once the snap ring is out, go ahead and remove the washer. Next step is to bend these tabs back so that you can loosen this nut. Once you've bent the tabs back, use a screwdriver and a hammer if you need to loosen the nut. And keep in mind how tight this nut was whenever you're loosening it, because you're going to want to put it back essentially the same torque that you found it as. Okay, you've got the nut removed. Go ahead and remove the lock for the nut. And then you've got a second nut right here. Go ahead and do the same thing to loosen that one. To this point, you should be able to wiggle the whole hub and rotor assembly. Just kind of wiggle it. Now you've got a plate here, or washer, and then the bearing right here. Go ahead and set that aside. Pull the rotor off. As soon as you get the rotor off, you have a seal here, and then the inside bearing right there. Now if you're reusing the seals, which is usually not recommended, it's always recommended to replace them, but if you're careful enough with these seals and they're still in good shape, you can reuse them. So if you are going to reuse them, just be very careful when you're prying on them so that you don't damage them. Alright, Go ahead and pull your inside bearing. Clean all the old grease outside of the hub if you're reusing this assembly, and also go ahead and clean all the grease off of the spindle as well. So we're going to want to put all new grease on here. If you're replacing the rotor, go ahead and remove all these bolts inside the hub. Once all the bolts are removed, I'm going to go ahead and stick something in here and hammer it down to separate the hub from the rotor. Alright, take your new rotor or your freshly machined rotor. Go ahead and set the hub back down inside of it. Line up the holes as best you can. Turn it back over and put the bolts back in. Once you've got all of the bolts started by hand, you can go ahead and tighten them up. So the next step is definitely the grossest, most nasty step, and that's where we're going to repack these wheel bearings, clean off the old grease from the bearing. And the most efficient way to pack a bearing is with a bearing packer. Once you get this cleaned off, you're going to take your handy bearing packer. So go ahead and put the wheel bearing with the tapered side down into the packer, the handle on, and then just work it around. And you're going to do this until you start to see new grease come out of the bearing, and I'll show you in a second here what I'm talking about. Alright, at this point you can see the new grease has penetrated from all the bearing openings right there. So once you see that, the bearing's good. So you can pull out the bearing, just kind of spread the grease around. Now we'll move on to the next bearing. Okay, take your rotor, go ahead and spread grease, new grease on the inside. Take your inner bearing, go ahead, which is the larger one, go ahead and set that down in there. We'll clean up your old seal if you're reusing it, or take your new seal, set it in the hub as straight as you can, and just tap it in. Just give it a little tap-a-roo, tippy tap. Try and make sure this goes in straight, else you could damage the seal. Once you've got it flush with the hub, you are good to go. Put some new grease on the spindle here. Make sure you've got it pretty well coated the whole way. Okay, you want to take your rotor, if you haven't already done so, and spray it down with brake cleaner to get all this anti-rust coating off of here. Go ahead and slide the rotor onto the spindle now. Make sure it's seated all the way. Make sure your outer race has plenty of grease on it as well. Take your outer bearing, carefully wiggle the rotor and slide the bearing in as far as you can. Spin the rotor and hub while pushing on the outer bearing just to make sure it's fully seated. Take the washer that sits behind the bearing. It'll only go on one way. There's a notch right here in the top. Slide it in. Once again, make sure the bearing's as far back as it's going to go. Take the first nut and go ahead and screw it on. Okay, now there is a proper torque procedure for these nuts. As a general rule of thumb though, you want to get it as tight as you can with your fingers. Take your screwdriver and your hammer and try and set it back to as close to as tight as it was whenever you pulled it off. So say if it took you like 1 or 2 hits from the hammer, like maybe an 1/8 or a 1/16 of a turn to knock it loose, then you're going to want to tighten it that same amount. Spin the rotor and kind of wiggle it to make sure that you don't have any play in the bearing and the hub. Take your lock ring, place it on the spindle. Take your other nut, screw it on. Give it a few taps with the screwdriver. Try and get it as tight as it was whenever, just like it was when you pulled it off. Okay, once you've got this nut where you want it, we want to bend these tabs back. And this will keep the nut from spinning and loosening up. Okay, once you've got the that lock ring bent back into place, go ahead and take the little splined washer, slide that on. You may need to pop the axle out just slightly so that it will expose the groove for the snap ring. If it's stretched a little bit like this one has, you want to take some pliers and kind of bend it back together so that it will actually snap into that groove. Okay, now once you have the snap ring in, you want to look closely and make sure that it actually snaps into the groove on the axle. If you can't see the groove on the axle, then it means that you haven't pushed this far enough back. So either your bearings probably aren't seated correctly, or you don't have these nuts turned in far enough. So at this point, if you can't see it, if there's no groove here for the snap ring, then you need to pull this all off and double check that your bearings are seated properly. Double check that these nuts are as far down as they should be. And once you've verified that, go ahead and put the ring back on. Put all the nuts and everything back on. Slide the snap ring into the groove, and then take your axle. You can grab it back here and wiggle it, and make sure that axle's not going anywhere, because you don't want this thing coming out. Okay, once you're satisfied that all this is correct, go ahead and make sure that you don't have any dirt or other foreign things inside here. All you want is just the parts that go in it and the grease. We're ready to put this plate back on. It's got these 2 dowels, one here, and then you'll see the corresponding holes there and there. You may need to kind of twist your axle a little bit so that the splines will line up. Take your bolt and washer. Tighten up your bolt and washer. Slide your bushings into place. Your washers. and your nuts. Put your dust cap back on. Go ahead and slide your caliper and brake pad assembly back into place. Once you've got the caliper in place, go ahead and put some bolts in. You don't have to tighten them up right now, we just want to get them in place. Okay, with the caliper bolts in place, I'm going to go ahead and attach this again. Make sure you get your bracket here for your brake line. Now go ahead and tighten your caliper and bolts up all the way. And put your wheel on.